Within chapter 15 as well, we see fighting and violence. This is something that occurs throughout the whole novel and links to the idea of crime. It's not what we're going to focus on in your piece of writing this week, but it is important that you have notes on this element of the text. There's two things that we've seen already within the book. We've seen the convict and his fellow convict, Compeyson, fighting in the mud in chapter 5 when they were discovered. And we've seen Pip and the pair of young gentlemen fighting in chapter 8. But we also see a fight in this chapter between Joe and Orlick before Pip goes to visit Miss Havisham. Let's have a look at that extract together. So what we learn about Joe is that despite his great size, he's described as a giant. Despite his great strength, he is soft and kind and a true Christian, and we see that in his manner of speaking, his morals, his values. However, when he is required to protect his wife, even though she's particularly nasty to him, he does. He comes between Orlick and his wife and stands up for his wife, and Pip acknowledges that he's never met anyone that would yet be able to beat Joe in a fight. Now Mrs. Joe quite humorously goes into hysterics during this fight. You'll see it on page 107 if you make a note of that. She exclaims "oh, oh, oh" quite a lot and seems to sort of lose control. Possibly some critics suggest it's some sort of repressed sort of sexual enjoyment that she gets from seeing the fight. Others perhaps see it as just a melodramatic reaction of a woman who shouldn't be exposed to such terrible things. I'm being sarcastic here, but that's possibly what the interpretation of original readers would have been. So if you look at page 107, you'll see the sort of humour within this fighting scene as well. But then at the end of chapter 15, we also see that Mrs. Joe is attacked, and we get a first sort of element of mystery thriller, of a sort of whodunit, who's attacked Mrs. Joe, who's the culprit, and that's a mystery which isn't resolved for quite some time within the novel. So that drama and violence comes at the end of chapter 15. So after Pip has come back from his visit to Miss Havisham's and his sort of side visit to Pumblechook and Wopsle, he recognises that Mrs. Joe will never be on the rampage again while she was the wife of Joe. So she's been irreparably damaged, she's been brain damaged, and this is as a result, arguably, of the fight earlier in the day between Joe and Orlick. It's Orlick who's done it, but that's not known at the time. So Dickens has ended this instalment with a dramatic conclusion. Remember, think about the reason why he will have done that. He wants readers to buy the next weekly instalment. He wants to keep his copies of All Year Round selling. So by ending on a dramatic cliffhanger, he's able to do that. Now, earlier within chapter 15, on page 110, we've seen some glimmers of guilt and crime. On his way back from Miss Havisham's, Pip goes into Pumblechook's with Mr. Wopsle, and Mr. Wopsle sort of makes Pip perform in part of a play. And within this play, a young boy sort of attacks his family member. And this is what Pumblechook says to Pip: "Take warning, boy, take warning, as if it were a well-known fact that I contemplated murdering a near relation, provided I could only induce to have the weakness to become my benefactor." So this idea of guilt and crime is sort of sticking with Pip, even though he's not sort of done anything. In this case, it was all just a play. Pumblechook's sort of threatening him and warning him. And then on the walk home, we see this paragraph here. Just read this. So hopefully what you'll recognise, particularly from the words I've put in bold, is the links and the connections with the early chapters of the book, this heavy mist and the fog that are over the scene, that sort of encapsulate the first few chapters of the text, and also work symbolically for Pip's inability to see, his lack of knowledge and his ignorance, but also the mist and the fog associate themselves with crime, this sort of murky underworld underneath society's sort of lowest levels. And so we get a little bit of foreshadowing, a little bit of a warning that we're going to see more criminal activity, just like we had the fog and the mist in the early chapters and we met the convict. We now get the fog and the mist again. It's a sort of clue looking back that we're going to see some criminal activity again, and it's connected with Pip. It connects with his sort of character. So they then meet Dol Jorlik slouching underneath the turnpike house, and that's a little bit of a clue that he is the culprit that we're looking for. So that guilt and crime links within to chapter 16 then. So once Pip's got home and discovered that Mrs. Joe has been attacked, he opens chapter 16 with these lines. So with his head full of George Barnwell, who was the main character in the play that he was forced to sort of take part in with Wopsle and Pumblechook, Pip is at first disposed to believe that I must have had some hand in the attack upon my sister. So he feels that sense of guilt. Even though he wasn't there, he knows he hasn't done it. He still feels that guilt and that connection with a crime. However, that connection then becomes more realistic when we find this out. So Pip recognises that the weapon used to attack Mrs. Joe was a convict's leg iron, which had been filed asunder, meaning filed down. And so Pip realises that the weapon that has been used was the leg iron that his convict had used Joe's file to break himself free back in chapter 3 when Pip had stolen the file and taken it to him. So Pip is, by some strange connection, associated with this attack upon his sister. This is what it does to Pip's mind. So that final sentence in bold is really important here. The secret was such an old one now, had so grown into me and become a part of myself that I could not tear it away. So this really emphasises the fact that the guilt is sort of stuck to Pip, and his connection with crime will sort of stick to him throughout the novel. It's so old now, it's almost absorbed into his skin and become part of his identity. He can't tear it away. He can't get free of that connection. And again, it's a little bit of foreshadowing, a little bit of a hint that the convict is Pip's benefactor. The convict is the person funding Pip's life as a gentleman through stages 2 and 3 of the book. He can't escape these early experiences in his life. And so guilt and shame both stick to Pip throughout this book. And that's a really big focus of Dickens, is for Victorian society. Is guilt of your upbringing and guilt of your class and guilt of your belonging. So really important to recognise this quotation as an important one. So let's just have a little bit of a look at your essay guidance. So remind ourselves, this is the question: evaluate the effectiveness of methods used by Dickens to present characters who experience embarrassment or shame. So let's have a look at some of the things you need to remember to do. And you will have had this in your feedback from your individual pieces of work that you've sent me this week. Use chapter 14 as your starting point. Remember, you're not provided with an extract within the exam, but I'm giving you this chapter to sort of guide you towards the first place to look. So use chapter 14 and the other chapters around it as your starting point for embarrassment and shame. Branch out into the rest of the novel if you feel comfortable doing so. So you can look back to the early chapters when Pip has stolen the food and the file from his sister and Joe. You could have a look at guilt and shame there, and if you're confident with the rest of the novel, you can look at extracts with guilt and shame in the rest of the novel as well. Plan and write an introduction based on the video I sent you a few days ago, and make sure you include a clear thesis. Remember, you can have a different thesis for each paragraph that links to a big overall idea, but you should have some sort of argument. So what is it that Dickens is trying to teach us or warn us or show us about embarrassment and shame as factors for individuals and for societies? Make sure that when you analyse Dickens's methods, you ultimately come back to your thesis and the ideas which spring from it. So analysis is all very well and good, but we must link it to that big idea. What's the point? Why has Dickens done this? Remember, when you write your thesis, or when you link back to your thesis at the end of each paragraph, use tentative language, Dickens perhaps, possibly, may have, could have, and use those analytical verbs to warn us, to expose, to criticise, to celebrate, to consider, to explore. Make sure you're thinking about the big idea and what his intentions were. Now, here are some things that I've paraphrased from the exam board, and these are really important to remember, and this is the next step for most of you in your writing now before we practice comparing. So it's really important that, yes, you need to use your terminology, the correct vocabulary, and show that you understand the right words to use to analyse language and literary techniques, but it's not enough to just spot those features, to just point them out. You must be genuinely analytical of meaning in the context of the whole piece of work. So any analysis you do needs to link back to the whole novel, the whole book, not just one section of it, but the whole thing. Have a look at this other piece of advice. So single word analysis, so picking one individual word and choosing to analyse it, is okay, but it alone doesn't allow you to be critical. You should be really aware that you need to be careful when you're choosing this evidence and look at the methods and how they connect with the writer's purpose and ideas. So if you're focusing on a particular word or phrase, how does it link to Dickens's wider ideas and the wider context? So be really selective in the methods you choose to analyse, and remember that sometimes a pronoun is just a pronoun. Okay, so don't overanalyze. Think about the big ideas and choose your methods really carefully to do that. Okay, so I think that's the end of the video. We'll see in a moment when I click onto the next slide. Remember, you can go back and watch this video as many times as you like, which I suppose is a benefit of remote learning. Sorry it's quite a long one today, but hopefully you've been able to use it to make some really detailed notes in your books or on your copy of the text itself. Remember, the essay shouldn't be something huge to stress about. All I want you to do is practice how to write an introduction, so it's another opportunity to practice general, specific and thesis, and no more than a side of A4. You can send me photographs or a typed up version, thinking about this idea of embarrassment and shame. If you want to challenge yourself and push yourself a bit further, you could have a look at shame in The Great Gatsby and where you think we see it and what Fitzgerald is trying to say about embarrassment and shame. And if you wish, you could try to write a comparative paragraph comparing how Dickens presents embarrassment and shame and how Fitzgerald presents embarrassment and shame. That's an extra thing to push yourself if you want to get a sort of head start on comparing before I teach you how to do that in the next few weeks. Okay, so thank you for watching today. Do contact me with any questions that you might have, and enjoy your reading and writing this week. Thank you very much.